Now it is 1:10. I'll start by saying glad acknowledgement for Simon Fraser University Vancouver campus. Simon Fraser University acknowledges the unceded traditional post-Scottish lands, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And welcome everyone to this roundtable event called Anti-Colonial Praxes in and Beyond Global Asias. And I am the main coordinator of today's event. My name is Piti Devajanti, and I'm Assistant Professor of Global Southeast Asian Studies at University of Victoria. Before I go and introduce every of our panelists on the roundtable, let me read out a bit of the abstract of today's roundtable so then we all have an idea of what this roundtable is about. So, what is said is conceptual frameworks such as Inter-Asia, the Asian Sixties, Afro-Asia, and global Maoism, with their distinct genealogies, possibilities, and limitations, emerge to remediate the assumption of Asia as a bounded unit, shared in both Orientalist and Cold War paradigms of Southeast Asian studies. Not only do they understand Asia relationally, connecting divergent locations of different scales within and outside of Asia, or more accurately, global Asias, as many of us are already familiar with probably the concept of global Asias, that because there's also another center of the study of global Asias here on SFU campus, right? But they also concern worldmaking political praxes and imaginaries that orient towards internationalism, decolonization, and socialism. This event further probes the political work of these conceptual frames in the current conjuncture of the Chimerica antagonistic cooperation. It seeks to address hitherto understudied and possibly more rigorous ways to articulate anti-colonial praxes in and beyond global Asias by being attentive to internationalist solidarity-making efforts that seriously consider race, gender, and indigeneity. This roundtable brings together emerging and established scholars to discuss these timely questions in the global Asian humanities, reflect on the state of the field, and propose preliminary future research directions. And you will see that the event runs from right now, 1:10 to 4:30, and it will be broken down this way. So the first hour and a half, each of us will be presenting in sort of informal, conversational way. What do we think of the theme, and the sort of prompt is to talk about the state of the field, but that also sounds very formal. So basically, what would each of us think in terms of their research, in terms of their relation with the topic on anti-colonial praxis in and beyond global Asias. And each of us will take around 15 minutes in the first hour and a half. And then we'll have half an hour break at around 2:30. There will be refreshments at the back. And it will be free time, and we'll come back to continue the conversation. And it will be a little more conversational. Right now, I feel like everyone's a little bit stiff because we just arrived here. At the second part of the roundtable, we expect it to be more conversational because the first part we have already done the talking. The second part we will be having a conversation among us and with all of you in the audience thinking about these questions again. Related to the theme of anti-colonial praxis in and beyond global Asia. And actually, we would also appreciate if you would bring your specialty on the local situation in Vancouver, right? Especially when it's related to the question of indigeneity, which is such a big issue here in this part of the world, Pacific Northwest, specifically Vancouver. And for me, coming from Victoria is also one very strong conceptual question, a conceptual framework that is ongoing, thinking about the solidarity between Asian studies and indigenous studies. So that would be the whole structure for today. And let me introduce every of the speakers one by one. And Rudy, one of the panelists, was actually mentioning that we should also ask the audience to introduce yourself too, but I think let's do that at the second round, at the second half. So hopefully all of you are staying with us here after the first half. Don't run away. All right, let me read every of the speaker's bio. So let me start with the end of the table here, Fabio Lanza. Fabio Lanza is professor of modern Chinese history in the Department of History and East Asian Studies at the University of Arizona. He is the author of Behind the Gate, Inventing Students in Beijing, and The End of Concern, Maoist China, Activism and Asian Studies in 2017. We show you, so the book is here. And he also co-edited with Jadika Piper Mooney the book called Decentering Cold War History, Local and Global Change. He's currently finishing a manuscript on urban collectivization during the Great Leap Forward, tentatively titled Bridge to Heaven. Next to Fabio Lanza is, also have a book, but not have the cover, Judy Susan Wu. Is professor of history and Asian American studies at the University of California, Irvine. She also is associate dean of research, faculty development, and public engagement in the School of Humanities, the director of the Humanities Center, and the founding director of the Center for Liberation, Anti-Racism and Belonging, or CLAB. She specializes in Asian American immigration, comparative racializations, women's gender and sexuality histories. She authored Dr. Mam Shung of the Fair-Haired Bastards, The Life of a Wartime Celebrity, and Radicals on the Road, this book, Internationalism, Orientalism, and Feminism during the Vietnam era. Her latest book, Fierce and Fearless, Patsy Takemoto Mink, First Women of Color in Congress, was published in 2022, is a collaboration with political scientist Gwendolyn Mink. Professor Wu is working currently on a book that focuses on Asian American and Pacific Islander women who attended the 1977 National Women's Conference and co-editing Unequal Sisters, 5th edition, and Women and Social Movement in the United States from 1600 to 2000. Next to Judy Wu is Rudy Duan. Rudy Duan is Assistant Professor of History and East Asian Languages and Culture at Harbour. She is a historian of modern China with research and teaching interests in social and political history, comparative ethnic studies, China-Africa relations, and international histories of the Cold War. Her current book project concerns how 20th century Chinese conceptions of race, ethnicity, and nation have been formulated in conversation with developments in Africa and African diaspora. Her recent works have been published in Made in China and Modern Asian Studies. And between Rudy and me is Zhifeng Liu, is Assistant Professor of History at Hong Kong Baptist University. So in terms of distance, he traveled the furthest. He is an intellectual historian of the 20th century Africana world with specializations in Black internationalism, anti-colonial thought, and Afro-Asian solidarity. His current book project traces a history of African American women radicals' engagements with China in the age of Bandung. His ongoing research has been featured. His ongoing research has been featured by The Economist and CGTN News, and his essay and reviews in English and Chinese on Black radicalism and African American political culture have been published in the Journal of Intersectionality, Journal of African American History, Journal of Beihang University, the paper Intia Media, Sina News, and Six Tones, so on and so forth. It's shy. Okay. And myself, I am Assistant Professor of Global Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Victoria. I teach an array of class on activism, human rights, public humanities, and anti-colonialism in 20th and 21st century Asia. My current group project is on left internationalism in Indonesia beyond boundary. I will be talking a bit about anti-colonial praxes in beyond global Asia, specifically on my understanding of scholarship in Southeast Asia, because that is my specialty. So my quick presentation today is called Internationalist Southeast Asia's in Conjunctures. There are lots of things on there, I'm going to talk about it later, but this is what I have prepared as my remarks. There are a couple of problematics that I have been thinking in the past few months. First, how to study leftist political struggles in Southeast Asia, both in the region and the diaspora altogether. So that's my first problematic. My second problematic that I've been thinking is how to situate them in a larger conjuncture that connects these struggles with one another to demonstrate the systemic processes with which they contend. I have since developed a relational framework, and I've been trying to test on this in the past summer when I was going around to some conferences. I have since developed a relational framework of internationalist Southeast Asias, I call it ISA, to connect internationalist praxes arising from various struggles against systemic forms of oppression in and beyond Southeast Asia. It is designed to substantiate the capacious framework Global Asias that's already out there, with more normative political content falling under the broad rubric of leftism. While Global Asias, again, as many of you are familiar with, as a conceptual assemblage, already brings important ethnic studies inquiries, such as race, indigeneity, and activism, into the Cold War foreign Southeast Asian studies. In my opinion, it does not necessarily orient toward left materialist causes. I hope that internationalist Southeast Asias, here, the framework that I'm trying to develop, will serve as a research cluster for analyzing and critiquing the capitalist foundation of oppressive structures in Southeast Asia. And at the same time, I hope for it to function as a political laboratory for advancing Southeast Asia left internationalism. I'll come back to this. I have two more paragraphs. Internationalist Southeast Asia operates on a foundational principle of capitalism contradiction that generates internal oppositions. Conjunctural mediations and subjective interventions may prompt these internal oppositions to take an internationalist direction. Internationalism, hence, emerges out of specific geohistorical materialist conditions and is premised on an analytical understanding that capitalism and imperialism are globally interconnected in multiple scales and in different rhythms. To track such geohistorical material conditions and the forms of internationalism they create, internationalist Southeast Asia's following prototypes created by one of my mentors in geography, Gillian Hart, proposes to chart the conjunctural moments in the 20th and 21st century Southeast Asia and historicize divergent forms of Southeast Asian internationalism within these moments. These key conjunctural moments aim to illustrate crises and turning points in the global history of capitalist development as situated and centered in Southeast Asia. But first thing first, what is a conjuncture? A conjuncture, as has been developed by Gillian Hart that I referred to earlier through Stuart Hall and Antonio Gramsci, refers to a relational mode of historicization that marks a qualitative shift in world history and considers multiple world-making forces and relations that come together to produce it. In each of the 5 historical conjunctures that I lay out here, I analyze the different modalities of the trifactor that are combined to produce them, namely war, capitalist accumulation, and internationalism. However, with the interest of time here in this presentation, I would jump right into the modes of internationalism and the scholarship that each conjuncture has produced. So these 5 historical conjunctural moments are high imperialism in the 1900s and 1920s, second, the interwar years in the 30s, third, what I call the Malaya, Bandung, Vietnam moment in the 50s to 60s, fourth, the refugee debt financial crisis in the 80s and 90s, and lastly, the more contemporary, the trade war or the new Cold War, 2010s and 20s. So, talk about the first conjunctural moment, which is high imperialism in 1900s to 1920s. We'll see that one major mode of internationalism during this period was actually pre-communist, right? Because the Communist Party was not yet actually emerging in Asia, because it emerged around early 1920s. The mode of internationalism that we get is more of a trans-imperial anarchism when it comes to Southeast Asia. And as I told you, I have also think about analyzing 2 other factors, which is mode of war and mode of capitalist accumulation, but I don't think we have that much time. I'll jump right into the example of scholarship that has already been produced on the first conjuncture, which is Benedict Anderson under 3 flags that talking about the anarchist connection, right, between Cuba, Philippines, and Spain. And then the second book is by a Japanese scholar, Koichi Hakimoto, talking about the concept of, I believe in the term that he used was intercolonial alliance. thinking about all these anarchist connections, again, between Cuba and Philippines. Second conjunctural moment is the interwar years. And the mode of internationalism that emerged around that period, as you may know, you can see from here, right, that it was the period of the Comintern, or the Third International. Therefore, many of the left internationalism that in that period was coordinated by the Third International or the Comintern. And we also see at that time also by the Comintern, a specific form of leftism that has been promoted by them since 1935 onward, was the anti-fascist front. So we see a lot of anti-fascist internationalism that emerged in the interwar period. And lastly, there are also quite a bit of especially in Southeast Asia, probably less so in East Asia, and I think this is also interesting, the diasporic Chinese internationalism. That many of these are sort of more of, I think at that time, nationalist, but bending more on the leftist orientation. And mainly they are like petty bourgeois who came to Southeast Asia, sometimes as workers or sometimes as traders, but they were somewhat having this orientation of wanting the Chinese revolution to happen back home. So they have been organizing among themselves in Southeast Asia to send money back to China for the cost of the revolution. And I'm not making these up. These are some of the scholarship that has already been done on this topic. You see on the far left, most of them are very recent. On the far left, you see Tim Harbour, Underground Asia, Global Revolutionaries, and Afro Empire. So tracking people like Chimerica, Ho Chi Minh, right? This anti-colonial connection happening in Southeast Asia, but also globally. We also have the Nanyang Revolution by Anna Belogurova, who is talking about the Comintern Chinese network in Southeast Asia in late 1800s to early 1900s. We have the third book by Gregor Benton, who is a great Trotskyist, working on Chinese migrant internationalism from 1917, 1945, closer to home by Moon Ho Jung at University of Seattle. University of East Washington, Seattle, writing about anti-colonial solidarities in Trans-Pacific area between US and Asia in the interwar period. And lastly, we also have one more of the classic book by Chris Gosha on Thailand and Southeast Asian networks of Vietnamese revolution, again, also in late 1900s and early 20th century. So these are some of the scholarship has been produced on left internationalism in the interwar period. And the period that I think is most prominent in this discussion about left internationalism, because there are lots of interest lately, is the 1960s, right? And you see, 5 of us are actually working on 60 too. So you already see the biases. The kind of scholarship that has been produced, and also the scholars that are assembling here to discuss on this topic, right? And it coincides in Asia with, you can see the end of the starting of Chinese Revolution, also the emergence of Bandung, Korean War, Vietnam War. Right? So therefore, there are already lots and lots of transformational events and occurrences that happen in that period, and therefore it also creates or generates a very strong contradiction, leftist contradiction in that period as well. And we can see that some sort of more, I think, obvious modes of internationalism that you see in that period would be first, third worldism, right? And if this is not a familiar concept with some of you, it would be the term that is being used mostly during the Cold War period, where the first world is a developed capitalist world, namely the US. Second world is a socialist world, communist world led by Soviet Union, and then the third world is more like decolonizing developing countries, right? And many of these decolonizing countries are also taking leftist or socialist orientation, but also don't want to be under the leadership, sometimes, not always, of the Soviet Union and China. Therefore, they organize among themselves and have been created and create this sort of, sometimes they don't use third worldism to describe themselves. It has been externally imposed on them, but this sort of retrospectively we call the leftist internationalism organized among the third world as third worldism. So that's one of the major form of internationalism in that period. And we also see the anti-systemic movement borrowing the term from Immanuel Wallerstein, right, talking about world system theory, and therefore thinking about many of the student movement, feminist movement, race-based movements, both in the US and elsewhere, as can be called together using the term anti-systemic movements. We also have global Leninism and global Maoism. So Fabio may be talking more about global Maoism as the main proponent of the idea, and also there's a recent book I will show you in the next slide that has been recently published by Salam Mendasi called Internationalism, in which he also talks about how Leninism has been practiced by many of the leftist revolutionaries globally, to the point that we probably can call that there, in parallel with global Maoism, there could also be something close to a global Leninism that has been revived in the 1960s as well. And lastly, what I myself find very interesting is the role of the World Peace Council. As many of you might be familiar, especially if you're the anti-war people, sometimes you may see, I don't know, in Vancouver, at Berkeley, sometimes you still see a couple of the anti-war activists still protesting on Berkeley campus saying that, oh, we don't want nuclear war, we are against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if you look at the history of the World Peace Council, they were not a front of the Comintern, they were not the leftist front, but they are highly ideologically affiliated with the global communist movement in the 1960s. So you could also say that the World Peace Council is one of the leftist semi-autonomous group that has been coordinating some of the leftist forces globally in the 60s. And some of the scholarship that has been produced in that period, actually there are many much more than this. All of us are working on this. But the examples that is more related to Southeast Asia would be some of the recent edited volume by Karen Stolt and Sulin Lewis on the life of Cold War Afro-Asianism, and the book that I just mentioned earlier by Salam Mendasi, Internationalism, and a book by one of our esteemed speaker, Judy Wu, here at the middle, Radicals on the Road, Internationalism, Orientalism, and Feminism during the Vietnam era. And then the fourth book here is also by someone not so far away, an alumni of UBC, Matt Galloway, The Emergence of Global Maoism, on talking about the phenomenon of global Maoism and the Cambodian Communist Party. The fifth book there is the classic, even by Vijay Prasad, The Darker Nation, is the person who comes up with the very iconic idea that third world is not geography or is not a place, but is a product. And lastly, the Worlding project there, edited by, is that Chris Connery only?
Rob Wilson.
Rob Wilson, yes, Rob Wilson and Chris Connery, and that was one of the books that Fabio would know more, but in my reading, it's one of the books that firstly probably discussed the idea of global Maoism in the global 60s. Fourth and fifth period are actually, I find very interesting, but also daunting. In a sense that when I was reviewing this chart, I realized that the fourth period, the refugee-led financial crisis in the 80s and 90s, a lot has been going on, but on the anti-revolutionary, counter-revolutionary, reactionary side, right? As usually has been understood in the scholarship as the global 80s, that is when global neoliberalism happened, right? You see Reagan, you see Maggie Thatcher, you see debt crisis starting in Mexico, you see the IMF, you see all sorts of neoliberal cultural revolution happening in the 80s and 90s. Therefore, it's very difficult to find what were or what are the continuing legacy of the 60s in the 80s. And some forms that I found, especially as they are related to Southeast Asia, are mostly the networks that are not so well coordinated. They are very much sparse all over the place, but I think it's also a very interesting avenue for research, because when you're looking for scholarship, there was actually none. So if any of you working in Southeast Asia, interested in thinking about these networks, sort of semi-leftist or leftish, not leftist but leftish network in the 80s or 90s, I think it would be a very interesting period to look at. And some of the networks are the urban poor network. You start to see like the NGOization, right, of many of these communists in the 70s, of the 60s and 70s. They all turn to be human rights advocates, right? And it has been chronicled and argued so beautifully in Salam Mendasi's book that there's a displacement of anti-colonial activism in the 60s to 70s into the human rights discourse in the 1780s and 90s. So firstly is the urban poor network. Second is political exile network, because in Southeast Asia, many of the authoritarian government came to power in the late 60s. So many of the activists there that were active in the earlier period, they were all exiled. Right? For Indonesian, for example, many of them having a very strong political exile network in the Netherlands and in Europe. Thirdly, the human rights and anti-war network. Fourthly, migrant internationalism, as we will see. That is when Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines started to send out nursing labor, right, from the Philippines, in coincidence with the high demand for nurses in the US. And therefore, many of these migrants, many of these nurses were also organizing around that period, forming the group that's called Migrante International. And lastly, the popular anti-authoritarian movements. As I told you, I could not really find as much of the scholarship, but there were lots of activism that happened around that period. So you see the Migrante International on the far right there, which is the internationalist leftist group that is trying to coordinate many of the nurses who immigrated out of Philippines to work elsewhere in the world. And you will see at the top is Kisula Mayo Uno, which is the main, let me look at my notes. It's translated into Tagalog as the May 1st movement. May 1st, of course, is Labor Day. So KMU is one of the major union established in May 1st, 1980 in the Philippines, and the Migrante International, that I say is leftist because it's part of the labor union of Philippines. And you see in the middle, it's the solidarity with the Timor-Leste struggle. So if you look back at this period, right, it was the period where Indonesia reinvaded Timor before East Timor became independent in 1999. There were also, it sparks sort of solidarity across the world for the East Timor independence and sovereignty. And lastly, I have to mention, this is also a very interesting internationalist scholarly group called ARENA, standing for Asian Regional Exchange for a New Alternative. I think some of the professors here might be more familiar with this group than me, but as a person who is very much involved with another group called Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Movement, ARENA was one of the sort of precursor to the Inter-Asian movement in Asia, and this was sort of the assembly of leftist or left-adjacent scholars working on Asia, thinking about all these. You can see, right? One of their volume is on social movements in Asia, and another volume is beyond Seattle. So some of you may already be familiar with what happened in Seattle, right? Which is the big protest against the WTO, right? Against neoliberalism. And it was after 1999 of the protest in Seattle that it was the beginning of the World Social Forum, right? That is the group that was trying to fight against the neoliberalization of the world. So you could see that these are some of the internationalist platforms or endeavor that happened in the fourth conjuncture. And lastly, I have to be very aware of time. Sorry. Lastly, the last conjuncture on trade war and new Cold War in 2010s, 2020s, I think this is also a very interesting time because it's contemporary. It's happening right now, right? And some of them that I see, especially as related to Southeast Asia, are the worker movements group, especially gig worker or precarious worker. We also see protests against Chinese revival of Bandung, and I think that's also make this occasion very interesting and exciting of why Bandung that happened in 1955 are being discussed or revived right now. If you don't know already, next year is the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, because it's 2025. Bandung was in 1955. And lastly, there is a new political alliances that are being reformed currently. So what I'm talking about, the anti-Chinese internationals that might happen was, some of you may be aware about the Chinese monopolization of the dam construction along the Mekong River, right? So this is one of the cartoons talking about, how the Chinese are using the construction of dams as a way to control and manipulate the low-stream Southeast Asian countries to follow what Chinese want, because if some of these countries negotiate or not allowing China to do whatever they want, then they would stop water from running, right? So it is actually a very, very sinister way of controlling the sovereignty of other nations by not allowing them to have water. That's basic human rights, right? So, and there's also another book that is published by Bloomsbury internationalism series called Damn Internationalism. It was like, oh, it would be so wonderful if there is a conference or there's another added volume on anti-dam internationalism. So that's related to the Chinese construction of dam, which usually I call infrastructural imperialism. And secondly, you will also see this was the group called Multi Alliance in Thailand and Thai for Palestine. And what they were doing on the street was both protesting against the genocide in Gaza, and also for the protest against the Minolai, the military government in Myanmar at the same time, right? So you see this kind of internationalism happening on the street on Southeast Asia and the globe, which is Palestine and Myanmar. And on the right, you see this multi-alliance, but usually you would also think about Myanmar and Thailand having this kind of constant tension, but this is the multi-alliance from the Myanmar side, that they are actually saying that, sorry Judy, we are standing with Thailand here. So it was the Burmese that was coming out to the street using the symbols that are shared by the multi-alliance people starting from Thailand, right? The three-finger salute, and saying that they are standing with Thailand. So there are also another kind of internationalism on the street that you're seeing here between Myanmar, Thailand, and other people, and other groups, Hong Kong and Taiwan for the multi-alliance. And lastly, that is the gig worker union in the Philippines that were coming out to protest against the oppression of the Burmese gig workers in Burma. So there's also, again, internationalist solidarity between workers in Southeast Asia, between the Philippines and Burma. And my last slide. I was also talking about new geopolitical alliance, and this one is where Indonesia started to take initiative in becoming, they say, fostering collaboration, enabling innovation for our ocean, our future. It is the first high-level meeting in 2023 on the Archipelagic and Island States Forum, right? Indonesia has always been understanding itself as an island country for a very long time, but they neglect that kind of oceanic infrastructure, but only last year that they were trying to make this connection again with the oceanic worlds at large, and thinking about, also very fascinating, they were using the idea, but I forgot to bring in the note, of fighting against triple oppression, using the term that you have heard in American studies, right, by Claudia Jones. Triple oppression against, I think, something like imperialism and something else. So you see that there's some kind of geopolitical shift there, that China, Russia, and US are not the only cores that countries in Southeast Asia would go to, right? But they're also trying to form their own cores into the oceanic world in the same way that they did with Bandung Conference 70 years ago. And last picture there, I tried to connect it to what happened in North America. The group is called, okay, let me see again my note. The group is called Khmer Girls in Action. So they are the descendant of Cambodian refugees in Long Beach, California. But when they come together, they're fighting, especially during the Trump administration, first one, second one, it will happen again. Hopefully it won't. Against the deportation of Southeast Asian refugees or undocumented Southeast Asian immigrants in LA. It includes Cambodian, Hmong, Vietnamese, right? And they are not just fighting for against deportation of their parents, Cambodians, but they are saying Southeast Asian solidarity, we are trying to fight against deportation of all. So there has also been some scholarship talking about the emergent form of Southeast Asian abolitionism in SoCal. So that's all for my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank DT and Michael for this opportunity to be in conversation. I'm going to focus on the third conjunctural moment that DT outlined for us. So that is the Malaya-Bandung-Vietnam moment in the 1950s and 1960s. So basically, we can call that area like the early Cold War, or perhaps the age of Bandung, which is what I use for my own work. And also, I'm going to talk about a group of activists who were not from Asia, but who were very interested in what was going on in Asia, and who sought solidarity with the Asian states and political movements. And also who were not really, I guess now we're talking about how race and kind of has played a role in kind of politics and knowledge production in Asian studies, but the people that I'm going to talk about also produced knowledge of Asia in the early Cold War. And so I'm going to talk about a group of black radical women who primarily talk about China, but also in the larger context of the Bandung movement, right? So what I'm going to talk about is, of course, informed by my own research. So I'm going to make 3 points here. So first of all, I want to talk about different visions of Bandung, like the spirit of Bandung, right? Or some scholars have called for the need for more studies of other Bandungs, right? So that's Sui Lewis and Caroline Stoll. So for them, other Bandungs refer to not to the states, not to diplomats, but to intellectuals, activists, artists, scholars, who also talk about the need for Afro-Asian solidarity. But of course, even if they were non-state actors, but they were not really entirely independent of states, right? But for me, I think we can also think about a different kind of Bandung, right? And this kind of a Bandung is about feminist, queer, and radical visions of anti-colonial and anti-imperialist solidarity. Right, so I see the people I study, this group of black women radicals, as constructing a different kind of Bandung. Right, of course we know kind of the iconography and historiography of solidarity, but not just Afro-Asian solidarity, but of radical solidarity in general, really kind of highlights the role of men. Right, sometimes the kind of solidarities that we talk about are primarily men's relationship or kind of homosocial ties. We think about one kind of iconic image of Mao and W. Du Bois, right? But then we don't talk a lot about the role of women in the history of international solidarity, and definitely not women of color. Definitely not radical women of color. Right? We think about how the kind of conjoining forces of sexism, anti-radicalism, anti-blackness, all kind of have made the contributions of black women radicals kind of not very known to people. But also still, while highlighting the crucial roles of women, and in particular black women radicals in this history, we also need to appreciate how difficult it was for them to completely break out of the dominant gender, the sexual, epistemic, and political straitjacket of the time. Right? So even if they, of course, their participation in this movement in itself was a challenge to kind of heteromasculine understanding of revolutionary solidarity, but sometimes they were, of course, they were often complicit in reinforcing kind of dominant discourses of gender sexuality. Right, so sometimes they talked about how important it was for them to support political leaders, right? In the sense, they still kind of upheld this idea of kind of male dominance. But also, sometimes they did not talk about kind of non-normative sexualities and how that could also be part of the Afro-Asian solidarity project. But what this means is that, on the one hand, we need to uncover and center their formulations, right? But of course, the formulations that did actually challenge the hegemony of heteronormative notions of gender and sexuality, but also at the same time need to be in conversation with feminist and queer scholars to kind of continue to unpack like how the complexities of women's internationalism at the time. And also, it's also important to focus on the kind of radical imaginaries, right? So it's important to recognize that we're talking about radical imaginaries, so their point of departure was really an inquiry into how kind of global structures such as patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism really interacted to produce and reproduce on freedom. And so they were not really talking about kind of liberal understanding of kind of global restructuring, right? They were not talking about addressing individual harm. They were thinking about the remaking of the world. And they were also sometimes talking about how they could transcend the nation state and how they could challenge kind of humanist liberal prescriptions for freedom. The second point I want to make is really the context of the Cold War and decolonization, particularly the geopolitical kind of messiness, really, right? So on the one hand, of course, we need to recognize how the geopolitics of the Cold War and decolonization facilitated radical activists, internationalist worldmaking, right? So in the age of Bandung, the kind of fostering of cooperation among those newly independent nations and also anti-imperialist movements required the consolidation of international platforms and infrastructures for interaction and exchange. Right, so there were, infrastructure of translation, circulation, and also conferences, right? Like there were multiple opportunities for people to meet each other, but also if you really do like a spatial history of all those activist travels, you will see that they were patterns, right? So people actually could travel, like talk to each other because of the larger political context of the Bandung moment, right? But at the same time, the geopolitical situation also made it difficult for these activists to continue their radical work, right? So on the one hand, even if they had that kind of proximity to centers of anti-imperialist activity. But then that proximity made it difficult for them to disentangle their radical visions from those of those nation states, right? So sometimes they had to find ways to merge their own visions with those of those nation states in which they wanted to forge solidarities. But also, sometimes, of course, that proximity to revolutionary centers also made them vulnerable to repression and surveillance on the part of the metropolitan core, right? Like especially those who still had ties to the West. But then also the larger geopolitical context also, I think, sometimes limited the options they have in the sense that the kind of larger global order sometimes made it difficult for them to consider the question of minority rights, which is also something that I'm thinking about as well. So in the context of Indonesia, right? So and so we know this article by Kito Swan called "Blended by Bandung." So how the question of Indonesian colonialism in West Papua was not given enough attention. We'll also think about minority rights in the larger context of Cold War. Like for example, at the UN, right? So minority rights, minority nationalists within post-colonial states could only receive hearings at the UN when they presented their concerns as indigenous rights issues. So I wonder the degree to which all those structures within the geopolitical context made it difficult for these activists to consider the issue of minority rights. And we can talk about that later during the Q&A. And the last point I want to make is about the agency of those activists. Right, so when we talk about tribal and all those narratives created by these activists, we often say, oh, these narratives were romanticizing what actually was going on in Asia. Right, so they were blinded by many things, and they also were probably too enthusiastic about the heavy promises of the kind of social and political achievements in those particular nation states. But I want to focus on how they might have also been trying to forge ahead with their own priorities. Right, so one thing I do is to kind of look at the divergences between these activist visions and those of the nation states that they engage. But the point here is not to kind of fetishize those divergences. The point here is to show that the activists that I focus on had their own agenda, and what they wanted to do was enlist all those nation states in this global struggle against white supremacy, colonialism, and imperialism. And of course, the Cold War context made it difficult, but there were spaces for them to forge ahead with their own priorities. Right. So some of the examples include, for example, Shirley Du Bois. So she was known as the wife of W. Du Bois. But in the context of the Cold War, she was able to basically be very friendly. Like she had access to the top leaders in Egypt, Soviet Union, China. Right? On all the nations, they were kind of in a network of competition, conflict, and sometimes cooperation. Right, but she somehow was able to navigate this Cold War context. In the context of the Sino-Soviet split, even though she was known by many to be very close to the Chinese government, but she did not seem to really want to pick a side. Right? So scholars have talked about that, talk about the importance of the Sino-Soviet split to these activists, and I myself also agree that they attempted to paper over those ideological differences because they had their own agenda. So in one word, what I'm trying to show is the degree to which they attempted to forge ahead with their own priorities. Thank you.
Let me invite Ruthie to go next. There's something.
So my comments are more methodological, pedagogical, and so they're going to be a bit more free-flowing, conversational. So I've been reflecting a lot, given the premise of this conversation today, about how we are probably the first cohort of students in Asian Studies to have gone through graduate school at a time when the utility of these new conceptual paradigms for understanding the global networks of decolonization, like Afro-Asia, Global Asia, the Black Pacific, right? They no longer have to be defended. They can be taken for granted, right? So where do we go from here, right? What's next? I feel like it's the early 2000s that there were so many works, right, in Afro-Asian studies for the first time. I'm, thinking, for example, of like Gary Okahiro's afterward, right, the Black Pacific and Afro-Asian encounters. I think that's from 2006. Like Robin Kelly's piece, like Black Life Now, that's 1999. So it's been a number of years since then, right? So I feel like this is a good moment to convene and like think alongside each other about reimagining in more expansive ways. So I also have three big questions, strands of thought. I imagine there are no answers, right, but hope they can be open-ended. So the first topic that I want to put out is about pedagogy, the teaching and the study of global Asia. So I'm in the third year of teaching East Asian and world history at Harbour. It's a small liberal arts college in Philadelphia, all undergraduates. And like many similar appointments, mine is in both history and the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. And the latter, so East Asian Languages and Cultures, is a department that still requires its majors, declining numbers of majors, to take foundational courses in things like Chinese civilization and Japanese civilization. And just the course titles themselves, right, assume that there is something unique at like the civilizational level about China and Japan and East Asia, right? That they are somehow not subject or differently subject to global forces that shape like Euro-American societies. And the content is what you would imagine they would be. And this department on my campus is not even a product of the Cold War. It's a relatively new department from the early 2000s, but in many ways, right, it still subscribes to older models, older conceptions of what Asia is, how we study it, its relationship to the world. And so what I want to think about is how we can most effectively integrate, right, the insights of these new paradigms like global Asian studies to the teaching of Asian studies in undergraduate classrooms when the institutional home for Asian studies in so many places is still like very traditionalist departments, like my own, right? So what is the potential for doing this? And I think of my goal in teaching as to undo, especially for a lot of my students who have no background knowledge on East Asia when they come in, to undo this like pseudo-Orientalist version of Chinese history or Asian history, right, that remains the version that they are introduced to, at least in American secondary schools. So a vision about like this essentialist Confucian past, and it just jumps from like Taoism to like the building of the Great Wall to the Chinese Revolution of 1949, and then it jumps to like the horrors of the Cultural Revolution, and then it ends. And this is the history that I feel like I'm sometimes up against, right? And it's the foil to my goal of having students see Chinese history truly as global history, right? As through their study of the subject, feel like they have obtained like a richer understanding of world historical dynamics like colonialism, racial formation, capitalist expansion, deindustrialization, right, the world wars, things like that. So it's a big goal, right? But I do feel like it's, and it's difficult to make sense of the conceptual gulf between some of these like new promising, right, paradigms for understanding, right, the structuring forces of race and gender and so on, right, in Asian studies, and then the very traditional curriculum of East Asian studies at a lot of colleges and universities. So just conundrum for conversation. The second question I want to pose concerns how we can best navigate the prerogatives of writing the histories of anti-colonial transnationalism in and beyond Asia. As in, I think it's really easy to feel like there are two opposite poles that our scholarship is kind of squeezed in between or pulled in both directions. So on the one hand, we want to recognize the incredible power of imaginative and collaborative politics against empire, capital, right? A lot of these historical actors engaged each other at the level of political visions. They frequently misunderstood each other, but their political projects, right, thrived on these misunderstandings. And as when I was a college student, first coming to these ideas and the earlier wave of scholarship on Afro-Asianism, I was really inspired by Robin Kelly's book from 2002, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination. And in the introduction, Kelly writes about how by black and white metrics of success or failure, perhaps most progressive political movements have failed because the structures they've sought to transform still remain very much intact. And yet it is precisely these alternative visions and dreams that inspire new generations to continue to struggle for change. So this is happening on one pole, right? Recognizing the power of these imaginative politics. But then on the other hand, I think we also feel compelled to own up to and recount all of the shortcomings to solidarity making, right? To acknowledge in like all of these ways that the third world, the post-colonial world, right, it was subject to similar logics of race and racism, exclusion, occupation, hierarchy. It's like however we track, right, these third worldist visionary projects, we feel like we, want to say again and again, yes, but this, right, but that. This year I'm co-facilitating a faculty reading group on the Black Pacific, and we definitely circle back to this tension a lot, this need to interrogate, right, this kind of like two-way dynamic. I know there's no answer to this, but I'm curious, how other people have dealt with it in their research and their work. And then lastly, this is a short point, I want to think about just the episodic nature to these intra-global South connections that are often the focus of scholarship in terms of Afro-Asia, inter-Asia, and so on. I feel like we tend to center snapshots, right, moments of encounter, right, arrivals. But in a recent discussion that I was a part of about a manuscript on pre-modern Afro-Asian relations in the Indian Ocean, we paused at why we approach this speculative history of Black mariners in Asia, conceding that we don't really know who they are, right? They may be Asian, they may be African, through the lens of arrivals, as in these darker-skinned sailors and slaves came to Asia, and it seemed like they never stayed, right? They never made a life, they never became a part of the community. So of course, like a lot of this history, right, is inherently speculative, but what are we not speculating about, right? What does a narrative that focuses, right, on arrivals and encounters, like, what does that potentially leave out? So just a few things that I hope we can comment.
Thank you so much for the comments and for the invitation to participate in the symposium today. I'm not going to be talking so much about the breadth of the scholarship, but focusing more on my current project and how it might speak to some of the questions that have been raised. I've been focusing on the United States 1977 National Women's Conference, and it was held in 1977. It was inspired by the United Nations International Women's Year that conference was held in Mexico City. But for some women from the United States who attended, they wanted to go back to their own nation and have a similar conference and conversation about what would be the national priorities for women. The 1977 conference, which was held in Houston, was the first and only time that the US federal government gave money for women to create a national political agenda. And what I find really fascinating about it is that it was not just a one-time event, but it was proposed as a grassroots mobilization with 56 pre-conferences held in every state and also in 6 territories. There was also a proposed follow-up conversation that was going to happen 10 years later. In the end, not as much funding was allocated, and the funding only passed by 1 vote. And if you calculate the amount, which was $5 million at the time, it was basically 4 cents for every woman in the United States. I'm focusing both on the overall conference, but specifically on Asian American and Pacific Islander women. And so these individuals have a very problematic relationship to the United States, either that they've been racialized as foreigners, as Asian Americans, or that they're indigenous islanders whose homelands have been settled, occupied by the US nation. And so I'm interested in how they position themselves in relation to the state. And in the context of this conversation, and also in light of my previous work, which has focused much more on radical activists, How do they use the apparatus of the state to both speak to the state, to perhaps occupy the power of the state, and perhaps to speak beyond the state? So I guess I'm thinking about two different main questions, and I'll offer some comments in response. So I think about the purpose of seizing power of the state, which I think is very much at the heart of the decolonial imaginary. Right? Even though it's a critique of colonialism and structures in existing states, there's also a desire to then gain self-determination. And oftentimes in that post-World War II moment, it is about the formation of one's own nation. And so there is that kind of libertarian idea of seizing control of the state. But there's also been critiques, especially of women's activists who collude with the state in the ways that they are contributing to governance feminism, they're contributing to carceral feminism. And I also think about my own work with Vietnam, that many of the anti-war activists who supported Vietnam as a cause became very critical of Vietnam as a country, because there actually has to be put into place a bureaucracy, there has to be policies about human rights, warfare with other countries. And so I think that tension between the radical imaginary versus the reality of a nation state is very much there. So that's one question that I'm thinking about. And here I'm paraphrasing Audre Lorde's insight, or asking the question, can you take the master's tools and use that in a way to deconstruct the master's house? Can you deconstruct an imperialist nation, a capitalist nation, by using the tools of the state? The second main question that I've been thinking about is the relationship between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And Asian Americans are often positioned as outsiders, and even if they critique the US nation-state project, there's also a strand within that politics of gaining full insider status, full equality. And how does this group relate to Pacific Islanders, even though within the United States they're often conflated in terms of census categories or in terms of political identification, so AAPI is frequently used. But for Pacific Islanders, their politics, again, can be very diverse, but there's often the politics of independence and liberation, right? Trying to seek independence from the United States as opposed to gaining greater insider status. So I'm thinking about those two big questions. And in my studies so far, I've been thinking about 3 different responses to some of those questions, those 2 questions. The ways in which activists have an imaginary that is both with and against the state, how they're utilizing state resources, legitimization of the state in order to articulate politics that also go beyond it. So one example of this, the 3 Pacific territories that held their own women's conferences, which was Guam, American Samoa, and the Trust Territories. And the Trust Territories is so vast. I was thinking about this in relation to Indonesia as well, right? The Trust Territories is so vast, it's actually the same size as the continent of the United States. But we just imagine it as sort of empty space because it's oceanic, and we think about islands as being tiny. But that space is so vast, they actually had, I believe, 6 or 7 different conferences in order to have a conversation across that expanse. But it's because it is nation-state sponsored with financial resources, even the US military, which plays such an outsized role in the Pacific Islands, they gave time off for their staff in order to participate. Their political symbolism was very much part of these women's conferences. For example, one of the booklets that was produced, the first image were these white men in military uniforms, even though it's about a women's conference. But even so, because there is that political space and the resources that were given, it allows women in those locations to then have conversations with each other. And they brought in the politics of a nuclear-free zone that was circulating in the Pacific in the 60s and 70s. They were interested in building political alliances, not only in the Pacific, but also connecting with Caribbean Islander feminists as well. They also discussed a longer lineage of Pacific Asian connections, not just in the Pacific, but also with various Asian countries, as well as Canada and other parts of what we might consider the Pacific Rim. So those occasions allow these activists to articulate political ideas, political solidarities that really transcend the United States. So that was just one example. Another example is that it's an occasion to critique the patriarchal forms of governance that were implanted in those islands. For example, in American Samoa, there's an existing Matai or chieftain system. And it's a predominantly male-oriented system, although women can also become chiefs within those particular communities. But the American political system was overlaid on top of that chieftain system, so that only political representatives, the representatives were only elected by other chiefs. So there's kind of a American political governance that's overlaid onto a patriarchal Samoan governance, and they really reinforce one another. But again, the women's conferences becomes an occasion in which they can critique these systems and offer alternative ways of thinking about what it means to represent oneself. Who should have the power to vote? Who should be elected and be part of governance? The second point I wanted to make is to not necessarily assume political purity among the various activists who are involved in these mobilizations, even if they are more distant from the US state. So one of the politics that I'm really interested in exploring is indigenous matriarchy or indigenous rematriation, the recentering of the mother within indigenous communities, because many of these traditions traditionally have been mother-centered, women-centered. But the centering of rematriation is also an age-hierarchical concept, so that you have younger women who are being elevated through the women's conferences, but they're butting heads against older women in these communities. Some of these older women are much more entrenched in missionary religious circles compared to their daughters. And these tensions emerge around the politics of reproduction. So for example, even though the delegation from Guam officially supported the right of reproduction, when the delegation went to Houston, only one person spoke up in favor of that particular plank. And that person was Filipina. She was not Chamorro, she was not indigenous to Guam. Another activist who wanted to stand up for that really felt pressured by all the older women in that delegation, who even said, you know, if you misbehave, we're gonna go tell your mother, right? So it's really interesting, some of these intergenerational dynamics that emerge, and to think about the long legacies of cultural, religious imperialism along with the dominance of the American state. I also wanted to end by thinking about who represents the oppressed, who represents those who are on the outside of society. And I think this becomes really interesting in light of critiques of Asian Americans as contributing to the settler colonial project. And these critiques have emerged predominantly in places like Hawaii, where Asian immigrants might arrive as racialized, excluded laborers, as othered, but over time, they really contribute to the capitalist economy. They become dominant players in terms of the political system. And so this is really interesting in light of who are the people being elected as delegates coming out of these women's conferences. In Guam, and also in some of the territorial locations, there was at the same time a resurgence of nativist independence movements. And so there were calls for only having indigenous representatives representing those locations. That politics gets challenged by people of other backgrounds who are also living in those locations. So for example, the one person who spoke out for reproductive rights is Filipina. Guam is the westernmost location of the United States. It's closer to the Philippines compared to any other location in terms of at least the states of the United States. It's 4 times closer to the Philippines than it is to Hawaii, for example. There's a significant migration between those two locales. They share a similar history of US imperialism, Japanese imperialism, Spanish imperialism, and so on and so forth. They are predominantly Catholic cultures, right? And so there's also a similarity in terms of matrilineality in both those locations. But there's a lot of tension between Filipinos, Chamorros, along with white individuals who are on those islands. And so the people who are critiquing this demand for Native independence are using the language of civil rights, using the language of minority rights, saying, well, we also have a right to represent ourselves, right? That we are somehow all equal in the setting, that the people who are indigenous should not have greater claim. And in fact, they're using the charge of chauvinism, or in some ways like a reverse racism against that charge of indigeneity. And so in the end, that position was not officially adopted, not having indigenous people represent indigenous, those islands. But in reality, that's what actually happens in terms of the demographic dominance of Chamorro people. They're predominantly electing Chamorro delegates. And so I think that's very interesting, again, what's happening in terms of political ideals and political debates, and then what's happening actually on the ground. So let me just end by saying that I think that we need to really think contextually and historically, and so I really love the idea of conjunctures, about the claims to the state, about what is possible when having an alliance with a nation state, what that alliance enables for people to want to go beyond that particular existing nation and to foster particular alternative forms of political ideals. And that the relationship between Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, as a result of their position in relation to the state, becomes very complicated and messy, that it's not just sort of a, one group is kind of the more radical one, the more pure one, that can offer a deeper critique of the US nation. There is that possibility, but there's also a variety of political stances that emerges from both people who identify as indigenous as well as those who identify as immigrants or as refugees.
First of all, I want to thank TVU and for inviting me and joining us. Did it pointed that I should speak from the perspective of global Maoism, so I will. I'm going to repeat something I've already written, but I'm going to try to move away from that particular formulation because I'm not happy with that. So, the reason I'm here, I suspect, is because I did write about global Maoism. I still find the perspective of global Maoism very useful to deal with some of the questions that we're dealing with here. But the problem is that, and I think I fall into the trap to some extent myself, I fell into the mistake myself, is that the perspective of global Maoism, this idea of Maoism in the 60s, and then I'll get to the 60s in a second, is that, so the question was, oh, okay, there's a bunch of people, initially the focus was mostly on white men and women, the French Maoists, for example, or radicals in the US. How they use this thing, how did this theory, this experience, it wasn't a theory of Maoism, how they pick up the literary book and use it for their own endeavor. Then the project expanded. Thankfully, as Rodriguez pointed out, we are past the age of sort of Afro-American interaction finally. But it became like, okay, how did Nepalese understood Maoists? How did Indian Maoists understood Maoists? How did Latin American Senderians people understood Maoism? Indonesian did its perspective, whether Maoists or not. But it remains still the idea that there is this theory there to be grasped. And I in that perspective, then, it's very easy for that particular formulation of Maoism to become meaningless. Sorry to be that worse, but you end up in the juvenile formulation that, Maoism is basically meaningless because all these people saw Maoism whatever they wanted, and there is no there, and who cares? I disagree, but it's very easy for an Asian theory, if you want, or a theory born in Asia to end up this way. I don't think it would be much different if you did it with Vietnam, for example. Oh, look, everybody is now in Vietnam as a state. And it's a problem, and Vietnam is meaningless, which of course it isn't. So I would like to rephrase, and also we are past that experience. We are, in post-revolutionary war, for better or worse, for worse. So I think we should try to rephrase this idea of this, and I look at global Maoism, but the moments that you guys pointed out, not so much as people like looking at something there and saying, oh yeah, I want that, and let me read the little report and figure out what it is, but more like a global discourse or a set of practices that were either shared or were in conversation with each other. And you have to find a name for it, and at the time the name was Maoism. And it was not, and I'm getting back in a second, I don't think the name was meaningless. In the sense that Maoism at the time provided a universalized theory, in the sense that it was a Marxist theory, it was a theory of national liberation, but also of liberation beyond nation, I would say. It was a theory that promised, I can't say the actual actualization, but that doesn't matter. As a theory, it promised individual liberation, individualized in a collective liberation, individualized collective liberation beyond the nation state. But it was a theory that was universalized, and I'm borrowing it from Chris Connery, as a practice. That it was eminently and always localized with attention to the specifics of the contingent case. It was so much so that the French could speak of Maoism in France without being stupid. That the Nepalese could speak of Maoism in Nepal without being, simply it was not a mimicry, basically. It was an actual correct interpretation of Maoism was universal, that was always localized. That existed only within the localized practice. As a theory, by definition of Maoism, I don't think I'm far off. So, in that sense, speaking of the global Maoism in this perspective, it's not speaking about something that is, again, an Asia model exported, or even an Asian model that is looked at, and people are like, oh God, yeah, we want the cultural revolution, yeah. In the most stupid case, yes, it was. But not in a general phenomenon. It is a moment in which a bunch of people are talking about the same things. Within their own specific circumstances, within the specific local contingencies. And that universal allows them to talk to each other. It's a short-term thing, it doesn't last for reasons that are historical and political, we can explain it, I think to some extent. But I think that's better to see that moment of global Asia, if you will, that way. At least it's useful for me. Now, what do we do with that? I don't know, because I have a tendency not to, precisely because this is a moment, historical moment, I tend not to extrapolate the possibility of that moment to another moment. So I don't know if you can sort of think, oh yeah, that's how it happened then. It happened then because there were specific moments in the global history of capitalism, there was a global crisis of capitalism, the global crisis of the colonial state, the long and movement, all these other things that very complicated. And we are not in the same situation, and we are not in the same situation as since. Right? I mean, we are in different contexts. But I think it's important to keep that in mind, to at least keep an eye out for the possibility of formulating a universal that's localized, in the sense that the only universal that can speak to the people has to be at the same time localized. Speak to very localized practices. I know this is very vague and abstract. Let me get to a couple of I don't know. I want us to reflect a little bit more on three terms that it seems obvious, but I don't think they are. One of them is global Asia itself. Tithia showed me all these books about global Asia. Some of them talk about global Asia as an inter-exchange of people, for example. People move from one place to the other, migrants, and migrants have things move, of course. And it's clearly important, but what's that beyond there? What is actually globalized as a specific political Asia in various specific moments? I know some people have more sympathy than I do to the Asia as method thing, China as method thing. I tend to not want to fall into that, but fine. If that's the case, we can discuss about that. But what is a specific Asia that's globalized? Because it's moments of encounters, sure, fine, they're important, but what's the political stake of those moments? What the political novelty of that invention that speaks to the global? The other thing is the long 60s, which I have used repeatedly, and I try not to use anymore. It's very difficult not to use it because it's such a mythic thing. You can say, oh, the long 60s, oh yeah, everybody says it. But in the sense that Jameson, when he used the long 60, and people when they use the long 60, mean a specific political project that has beginning and an end. And the term long 60 allows it to be vague, I think, just first. Not for Jameson, I think Jameson was actually precise in his realizing the 60s. But for me included, I think it's a very easy sort of like deployment of, yeah, the long 60s, and then you can skip what actually the confines of your political experience are. So I don't have a solution for that because I don't have one, but I think it's worth keeping the chronology very clear. And finally, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist. I wrote this in my review of Salomon Days, it's been genealogy, roundtable together. And I started my review by, there was a meeting in May this year, and in celebrating the anniversary of the Committee of Conceptual Scholars, and I was there. And I was looking at one of the, now octogenarians there, and asking, what do you think it's the, because he argued it was a legacy of CCAS and still alive. I was like, what is that? And he said, oh, anti-imperialism. And anti-imperialism in that context, sorry to be brutal, was absolutely meaningless. It didn't mean anything. Because besides generic anti-US sentiment that last you can drag from, right from the 1950s or earlier to today, sure, fine. But besides that, what's the political heft of anti-imperialism in that specific formulation? So I don't know. I mean, we'll have to. Again, we have to be very specific in what anti-imperialism mean. And let me end with an idea that I have for a future project. You can tell me that I'm stupid. This is not very well formulated, but one project that I think I want to do, because I think it reflects some of these concerns of mine, I want to study something that's really not, three experiences that are not directly connected, but I think in my brain all investigate a particular question of related to the history of capitalism and to the history of socialism. which is the question of the subjectivity of the work, which is really blunt, the subjectivity of the work. And one of the experience is the experience of so-called urbanism or workerism in Italy, an independent, very left-wing, extra-party organization of workers, mostly in Turin and other places, the 70s. Same time, organization of black radicals, unions in Detroit mostly, the drum, for example, the revolutionary movement. And at the same time, worker experiments in factories during the Cultural Revolution. I have a vague feeling that this all speak about some form of, again, global discourse, connections that even if that connection might not even exist practically, although I think they actually do exist also practically, but that speak to a sort of truly global interrogation of the same problems, including what is a worker in either a capitalist system, what is a worker in a factory, in a modern industrial system. Can a worker think, basically? And now does it work? I'll stop. Thank you.
So you have heard of us. That's our 5 perspectives and 5 views on what we think on the topic. And